I couldn't help but notice that you've clicked on and are presently listening to an episode of the Paranormal Patio podcast. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your support. And if you want to continue to support us, the best thing you can do is share our episodes on social media. That's right. You can tag us in everything. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find us on paranormalpatio.com, where you'll find articles, links to information from our past guests, as well as, every episode as it comes out. Also, head on over to Patreon. Patreon.com/BeyondThePatio. You can get a monthly live stream, at least one. Sometimes we do more. Exclusive bonus content, early access to all of our episodes. And starting with Season 3, I've got to move Season 1 to the archives. So they'll be on Patreon as well, and you can listen to them there. Thanks again for your support. And hey, let's get into the episode. What kind of weird thing are we talking about today? On this episode, I'll be speaking with Sadhu Dah, a Thai Buddhist magician who specializes in exorcisms. And we're going to talk about all that. We're also going to talk about ghosts and reincarnation and a handful of other things. And this is actually one of my favorite interviews, I think I can say. Definitely plan on having Sadhu back. And I can't wait to finish the conversation because it really felt like it went way too fast and I didn't get to ask the questions I wanted to ask. And I'm sure there were things left on the table for him to say as well. Before we get into the episode, there was a Buddhist quote that I wanted to leave you with before we get into the episode. With our thoughts, we make the world. Now, we've heard that before. You remember Barry Gellis in Season 2? The thing with Barry studying under Jane Roberts and Seth, and the thing that I've learned the most from reading the same things that Barry was lucky enough to witness firsthand, thought creates reality. What you think about, how your life is, that's the life you're going to have. So think wisely and love yourself, because no one on the planet deserves your love more than you do. So keep that in mind. But enough of that. Let's get spooky.
You're listening to the Paranormal Patio Podcast.
Welcome back to Paranormal Patio. As always, I'm Jason, joined tonight by Sadhu Dah, and we're going to talk about, Sadhu, what are we going to talk about tonight?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on here. Yeah, I guess if there's a question about magic, specifically Thai Buddhist magic, anything paranormal related, especially with exorcisms and things of that nature, or anything weird in general that you want to get into, I'm all ears, man. We can just talk about it.
That sounds great. Let's start off with a little bit of your background. Tell everybody who you are, what you do, what you're into, that sort of thing.
Yes. The hero's journey that I went through.
Yes.
So I had a while back, about 10 years ago, first started this whole spiritual journey, not actually trying to embark on a spiritual journey. I came from a very negative background and upbringing. There was a lot of gang violence where I grew up in Central Texas, and both my parents had went to prison, and so I was just kind of in a very negative environment, and I didn't really have any role models. Well, towards the later part of my teen years, I ended up going by this Buddhist temple, this Theravada Thai Buddhist temple in my hometown that I don't really know why I was drawn there. I guess I just wanted to kind of check it out. Never really been drawn to Buddhism before that point. I was actually raised Christian, but I'd been kind of questioning things a bit. And so I found myself at this temple, and that's when I met my first master, Master Thanapal Pakti, a very incredible monk and just very loving human being and so wise. He ended up kind of taking me under his mentorship. I kind of left at that point for a little while and I joined like a local Wicca coven. I ended up becoming a Wiccan high priest, got very much into the esoteric side of things, then found myself over in Washington studying under a lama. And I mean, from Tibetan, lineage, Bonpo, if you will, Tibetan Buddhism. And it was really interesting because it was just bouncing back and forth from different lineages and masters and teachers. And before I realized it, I was kind of having this supernatural experience, like the TV show. I was traveling around with one of my masters, and we would go look up various different haunted places across the United States. We would just go there, and we would go and we would solve paranormal cases. Wouldn't really tell anybody or display it. We would just kind of catalog it for our own records. Experienced massive amounts of phenomena. So many crazy adventures occurred along the way. And it's just kind of, I don't really know where to begin the whole story, if I'm being honest, because there's been so many introductions to different stories throughout my main story. But it all ended with me becoming a Thai Ajarn, or occult professor of Thai traditions, studying different Thai Buddhist animist witcha or magical practices, and working with spirits and using various different magical practices to help bless and cleanse people, to remove entities, and to perform exorcisms.
So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of questions that I want to ask. Well, a few questions I want to ask, just based on what you've already said. First off, how large of a Buddhist community exists in Texas?
Surprisingly bigger than you may think. The temple that I went to, as far as I knew, within maybe a couple 100-mile radius, was the only temple there. And there was a very devout amount of people that would go there. I'd say maybe like a couple hundred people, like in the community, and maybe from, nearby cities that would come there. Usually, an Asian background, but there were definitely different ethnicities that would come there. And this was Theravada Buddhism. So Thai Buddhism, there are many different types of Buddhism, as we know.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really interesting. Yeah, I never would expect in Texas, of all places, that there would be any sort of Eastern philosophical / religious belief system. Just from the little time that I spent in Texas, and the reputation in media that Texas has as being, really conservative, really Christian. It's really fascinating to know that there exists such a place, actually. I mean, yeah, that blows me away.
Yeah, where I live in Washington right now, in the city that I'm at, there are no temples whatsoever. But if you go down towards the Seattle area, which is like a little over an hour away from me, and in between there and around the Seattle area, you have probably about like 9 or so. I would say under 12, but at least 9 different types of temples, and they're not all Thai. Some of them are like Soto Zen, Chinese. There's even like a Taoist Shinto temple as well, which is very interesting.
Yeah, see, no, none of that surprises me. I would expect Washington to just, be loaded with all different kinds of viewpoints, and kind of brings me to my next question. How do you go from studying Buddhism to moving across the country and falling into a Wiccan practice? How does that happen?
The Wicca, I should have been more specific about some of these parts of the journey. The Wicca was like, there was a metaphysical shop in my hometown, and once I had kind of started to get a little bit more into the spiritual side of things, I found myself going there, and the high priestess of that temple, her name was Charlita, and she ran like this metaphysical shop out of a garage in Texas. And so that's kind of where I spent a lot of time going to like her classes and studying and learning with her, and then going back to the temple. And then I ended up going up to Washington for reasons unrelated, when I was up there, the way that I met the Lama that I met, and started going on those crazy adventures of, basically one paranormal crisis to the next, was I answered a Craigslist ad. There was a group of paranormal investigators that were looking for new teammates, and I was curious at this point, so I went with them on a case. Long story short, we found a talisman hanging from the rafters of a decaying barn that used to be the grounds of an old mental asylum. I took said talisman because it was just left there, right?
Yeah.
And then one of the people who was with us, she put it on and legitimately became possessed, displaying all kinds of phenomena that would be unbelievable if you had not witnessed, like facial morphing, actually walking up a wall, being burnt by a silver cross and showing actual blisters and marks where the cross had been put on her. That was the moment that broke my reality, and there was no turning back from. And it was also through that introduction into the paranormal investigative side of things, she had a master who she had been training with very, very barely, like minimally. And then she had me call him in and out of these bouts of possession that she was going through and battling. And so I'd kind of talked to him, explained what was going on. There's a lot more in-depth version of the story, but it ended up being me becoming his student, and then later his apprentice, and studying with him for years. And I'm actually still in contact with him this day, and I do take advanced lessons from him on deeper paths of mysticism.
That's fascinating. I relate a lot to a lot of the Buddhist philosophy. I'm a big fan, I guess you could say, but I'm not a devout practitioner of Buddhist traditions. Case in point, I have a tattoo of the Buddha on my arm. It's not something that you would do as a practicing Buddhist because of the potential of it touching the ground and being desecrated, the image of the Buddha being desecrated.
Right.
It's more like I'm a fanboy, I guess. Although I do agree with most of what I have learned. Definite believer in reincarnation and karma. I think that the experiences I've had in my life, there's no way I couldn't believe in either of those things. Because of the reincarnation belief within the Buddhist philosophy, how would you describe the existence of ghosts, in our world? And also, we'll let you do that. That's probably going to be a big unpacking, but I would also like to ask before I forget, I want to talk about where magic fits in to the Buddhist philosophy.
Yes. Oh, this is fun. So in reincarnation and ghost, because it seems like there are two things that there's a lot of proof for both of them individually.
Yes.
But they also seem to contradict each other. That's what I find so fascinating about magic and mysticism in general, is when you start getting into these paranormal or these metaphysical concepts and teachings, basically just this knowledge that we're not normally exposed to within mainstream society. We start to find that there are two different things that can be true at the same time within varying levels of each other, and it's actually not contradictory. What I mean by that is, so when a person dies, are you familiar with the Vietnamese concept of quan?
If you would have asked me this like 3 years ago, I probably would have said yes, but any knowledge that I have had on this has dissipated greatly over the last few years.
Quan is kind of similar to like the Vedic concept of the Atman, right? Mm-hmm. So your soul, if you will, the highest version of your soul would essentially be who you truly are. So any iteration of that, any ripple of your soul in expression is kind of similar to you and your physical body right now changing a shirt. Who I am, Sadhu Dah, is just a shirt that I wear.
Yeah.
This might be a good shirt. It might be one of my favorite shirts, but I'm not always going to wear this shirt. But that doesn't still mean that it's not my shirt, even if I no longer own it or wear it.
I follow you.
So we have this similar aspect with the Atman, right? So you have these expressions of your soul which coalesce together to form the entirety of your soul. They're all you individually and they're all you collectively. Now with Quan, the concept of the soul is spoken of in a similar fashion in the Vietnamese mysticism. What they're talking about is an individualized expression of the soul that can remain independent on its own, even when the bulk, or let's say the remainder of the soul, has progressed, grown, or gone within different vibratory elements of existence. So you have a ghost, which is the former person's now conscious level of interaction with the world. They no longer have the physical body, the anchor that kept them in this three-dimensional space, but they now exist within the astral. So they're still alive and conscious, but they no longer have a certain element that allowed them to live within the physical world, but through means of feeding and anchoring through objects, land, people, etc., they are able to kind of still have interaction with our world. Now, when a ghost dies, and yes, ghosts do die, this is called the second death. That is when you'll either have a shell or this remaining energy of this ghost body, which can get picked apart by astral parasites and fed on, or kind of go in this autonomous mode where it kind of does its own thing, or through the collective love and vibration of memory from other people that knew this individual, it can kind of feed and sustain the life force of this ghost shell, which is no longer housing the actual soul of the person that ghost body belonged to. Just like the physical body, it no longer houses the energies of that ghost body. So think of it going up in a level. So now that ghost body is no longer controlled by that consciousness or that person, but it still remains as the identity. So then that person can reincarnate, but they can have a ghost body that watches over or is interacting because it's being fed in a certain way. It's continually being programmed by the love and memories of their family members. Or it can get hijacked by different entities and controlled or fed upon. Or you can have a ghost that just simply wanders around, doesn't cross over, evolves in its own way as a ghost before even going through a reincarnation process. They join into a collective astral creation with other family members that have gone on. They'll share in this astral heaven or this place where they gather together as souls till that spins out, and then they all collectively go and reincarnate together. But while they're in that astral palace of sorts, they can go down and check on loved ones. So there's quite a bit that can happen with ghosts before they reincarnate, and even after they reincarnate with the ghost body specifically. Now we can move on to magic if you feel like that kind of helps explain a little bit.
Yeah, definitely cleared up any questions I had about that, but in the process, you've formed another question that I want to get to before we move on, because this is fascinating. I'm really into this conversation. Your thoughts on tulpas and egregores, conscious thought created thought forms?
What's really interesting is you mentioned tulpas and you mentioned egregores. So you're directly speaking off the bat about a type of magic that is universally practiced in many different traditions. So in the Tibetan Bon Po lineage, that is where tulpa actually originates.
Correct.
That is where that came from. Now, with egregores, you're talking more of like a mixture of ceremonial magic, and you're talking like Wiccan pagan practices. That's where a lot of, and chaos magic as well, that's where a lot of egregores, servitor, that kind of terminology comes from. Hun Peant, which is it translates as robot guardian, so very much so the same thing. And there's different ways of making it. That comes from Tai Wicca. And then you have like the golem, right, which comes from, mystical practices of Judaism. We have these different flavors of the same thing.
Right.
What that is telling us is that this is a magic that is independent upon the scope of the user. So this is a think of it as like a science, right? We have more than one way to filter water, for example. You could do it so many different ways. If you're filtering water, no matter how you're doing it, at the end of the day, if you have filtered water, you went through the process of filtering water, no matter how you achieved it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of the same thing with a self-created entity or a spiritual being made from energy with a specific purpose. What we're simply doing is we're tapping into the imagination, which is where all magic begins, really. If you have no imagination, how could you ever possibly hope to perform magic? Because it's within imagination that we construct something within the astral that we can pass up into the fourth dimension and then allow it to manifest forth downwards into the physical dimension. So it's kind of like a wave riding up and down. So you're creating this baseline pulse, and your physical body is the conduit of that baseline. But that pulsing up and down is the consciousness taking energies, moving energies, and mixing energies in a specific fashion, which the end result in this case is making a servitor, an egregore, hunpeon, a tulpa, right? So really, I mean, I guess if you wanted a little bit more of an explanation here, you'd have to give me a direction of what you kind of want to know from there.
No, that you did a great job. I just wanted to see what your surface thoughts on it were, which were exactly what I expected you to say, which is fantastic. No, great, good job. Yeah, good job with your opinion. Hey, good job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's my opinion.
Yeah, did it all yourself. No, that's really good. Really solid explanation. You definitely know your stuff for sure. Yeah. Now we have to get into the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about here, I guess. And I'd love to hear your explanation of the existence of magic within Buddhist principles.
Yes. So first we need to understand the Buddha himself had spoken of magic as being a distraction on the way to enlightenment. Some people will kind of take this directly out of context in saying that we shouldn't do magic or that magic will not serve you. Now, I feel like that's a little bit too restrictive of a thought. Essentially, what the Buddha was really saying was like, oh, that's cute, that's fun, but I like it the way that one of my masters, the Lama, one of the Lamas I studied under, he explained it to me as there are two different sides of the same coin. So magic is more of the yang aspect. It's more of the external force, whereas like mysticism is more of the yin aspect, more of the internal force. And they both lead to the same thing. So you can achieve enlightenment. You can achieve effects manifested for specific purposes. You can do all of these things that magic allows you to do with the internal alchemy of mysticism as well. So it really just takes a little bit longer to get there in some of the higher levels that mysticism will get you there shorter. And the way that I describe that is it's going to take you longer to cultivate the internal mysticism and be able to do very substantial things, whether they be like states of samadhi, higher states of consciousness, and be able to perform really weird, interesting things that come from cities or supernatural abilities that develop from extended time spent in meditation and developing these states of samadhi. So that takes a lot longer, but once you have that, you can do things in lightning speed. Now with magic, you can do a lot of that big stuff pretty quick off the bat. As long as you know what you're doing, it can be very dangerous. It can be very reckless. And a lot of things can go wrong. And we are talking about very specific sciences. And I guess that's where some people meddle and they play around and they don't realize, like, the whole concept of summoning a demon. And then all of a sudden, they're calling, an exorcist and calling someone like me to come and help them. And it's like, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. I'm like, well, you summon a demon. That's what happens. So it's kind of the same thing, I guess, is over time with the mysticism, you're cultivating it slowly, so you're really appreciating every little grain. Whereas with the magic, a lot of stuff can be happening at once, and you're not necessarily aware of it, so you don't really appreciate it. And it isn't until you develop a balance between the two that you kind of blend both of them together and flow within, the eternal river, the Tao, if you will, harmoniously. And it's no longer magic. It's no longer mysticism. It simply is. It's just life. And it's being in communion with life.
I love it. That's fantastic. Let's clarify the terminology of demon within your belief system. Are we talking about the traditional Christian explanation of what a demon is, or is it just a shared terminology?
I like the word demon because it's more of a visual representation and common understanding, but it is not, for me, what I literally mean by that. And I do usually kind of like preface that and explain that with clients or anytime I'm teaching. And then from then on, when I say demon, they know exactly what I'm talking about. So for me, a demon is a quasi-physical entity that is malevolent and non-human with diabolical intent. That is a demon to me.
I'm on the same page. Let's say a Christian person comes to you and says, I think I'm being possessed by a demon. They mean the demon in terms of the Christian scope of what a demon is. It's a servant of Satan or, whichever aspect of Christianity that they follow. Their belief in the existence of a demon, as stated, does that therefore make that real in their reality?
A lot of these entities will play to people's fears. And you got to think about the concept of how, these entities tend to feed. They have these tendrils and they have this way of kind of piercing the auric body, and usually they'll go through the Wingate channel, so the back of the neck. It's one of their favorite places to enter. It's kind of like a weak spot in our etheric armor, if you will. When these entities feed, they inject us with, like, depending on the type of entity, it can kind of be like a paralytic poison, hags, if you will, sleep paralysis, things of that nature. What you're having occur is, as they're feeding, they're connected to you. So they can kind of turn up the nightmare. They can kind of tap into what your own fears are. And it gives them, the person being affected, it makes them feel like this thing can read their mind, or, it's inside them. And generally when people say that they're possessed or they have something like that occurring, I kind of tend to go by, how Ed and Lorraine Warren had stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. I had a teacher who kind of elaborated that and put more work into it, and then I kind of added on to that. And so we actually broke it down into 5 stages of possession. But generally, when people are approaching me in that context, they're experiencing stage 2. So they're experiencing overshadowing. So this would be like transient possession. The entity has not fully integrated with them. It has not fully taken over its host, but there are these passive states where they're in a trance-like state where they can be heavily influenced by the entity, where there is a sort of merging occurring. And in those states, when these entities are preying on these people's fears, if somebody has a very specific visualization of hell with burning and fire and the way that like traditional Satan, pictography like looks, it's going to play with that imagery all day long. More so because that's going to affect you more than it appearing as a frog. If you were absolutely terrified of frogs, then it would kind of play against that. But that's not a common fear, right? So right. It's gonna go more with what your actual true fear is, subconsciously. It's gonna play on that. I've come onto cases where, this person thinks that it's a demon attacking them, and it's more a wraith. It's more of a corrupted human spirit. And that's actually what's happening. I find wraith possession and wraith attachment is far more common. And so is like ghost attachments as well. But with ghost attachments, you tend to see more of an actual person's personality. And the phenomena tends to be more in line with like how a human would behave. When it's a wraith, it's more vicious, more animalistic. The same with what I call beast classifications, which are technically demons, but I consider them more like in the astral parasite category. But there's different types of astral parasites. You have some that are not really sentient. Then you have some that are more diabolical and obviously more sentient. And then you have like the traditional demon classification. And those are more diabolical in nature, more manipulative, right? They're they're very willfully deceptive. They're playing a game and they know how to play it very, very well. They're very intelligent. Depending on what somebody tells me when I'm, first coming to help them, I don't really put a lot of stock in that. I'll actually ask them, well, okay, so is the phenomena occurring in the daytime? Is it occurring only at night at specific hours? What about certain lunar cycles? Like, if this has been going on for a few months, does it tend to happen around the same time? Peaking in activity, like towards the end of the month, beginning of the month, and finding out all these different things are going to give me clues as to what kind of entity I'm actually dealing with. A lot of what the client says as far as what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, to some extent that is relevant to me and it is important. But more so, I want, as they say, no pun intended, the devil's in the details. So I want to know about the things that they haven't even put any stock of thought into. Repetition of patterns and etc. Are there water lines around the house? There's a whole multitude of things that are actually going to tell me far more.
The people that come to you for help, their religious background is predominantly what?
It tends to be either generally non-religious, but I wouldn't call it quite atheist, or they tend to be Christian. And it's really funny to me because when people come to me that are, genuinely devout Christians, they tend to come to me almost with a little bit of shame.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, you poor thing, come here, because by the time you contacted me, you know very well that I'm not a Christian. I have nothing against Christianity, but that's a very terrifying, as a client, that's a very terrifying place for you to be, because you're stepping outside of the comfort zone of your own religion, because you feel like your own religion, what you've been taught your whole life, what you've put your stock and faith into, these healers and these people who are supposed to be able to make this go away, or these prayers and these Bible passages and these things that you're taught work, all of a sudden they're not working and they're not helping. That's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. And then going to somebody, you have no idea what they really do. You don't really understand their beliefs, but they come highly recommended and they seem to have a lot of, effective past cases and clients, or they were even referred to you. That's huge bridge of trust to cross.
Sure. Have you had many atheists come to you for this sort of thing?
Yeah. And generally they take this approach of, I don't really understand what's going on. I don't claim to understand, but this isn't normal. A lot of them will be like hesitant to call it like a ghost or a demon or anything like that. They'll just be like, there's something invisible, or I'm losing my mind, and, traditional psychology is not helping here. No matter how much counseling I go to, that's not working. Medications aren't working. I don't really believe in these spiritual masters or teachers, but everything's kind of leading me to say, why not try this? It couldn't hurt. Nothing else is helping. So I get those kind of people tend to come to me begrudgingly and very skeptical. And I'm like, hey, by this point, you know that you don't understand everything that's going on. So like you said in your own words, what do you got to lose? Give me a shot. Let me help you out.
Yeah. Is there a correlation between the amount of belief someone has in what you're telling them and the success rate for you to help them out?
I would say that's not necessarily as important of a factor as me being able to address a client's trauma first. A lot of times with these entities, they're a vibrational match with the person. It's the only reason why they're able to feed on them and attack them. And a lot of times the only thing that keeps me safe is me being out of the vibrational reach of some of these entities. So what I need to do first is I need to address their trauma. I need to address, even things that happened in their childhood far, before this entity or whatever was going on was even a factor. And I think that's what makes me more successful than some other people that are in the type of field that I'm in, and what I do and how I have the success rate that I have is because I actually, I do regression work, hypnosis, soul retrieval, energy healing. I do this on my client before we directly approach the entity aspect of things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I've actually had the case resolve and clear itself before I actually directed energy and attention towards the entity.
So to go back on kind of how we opened with the case of you finding the talisman and I think you said it was a young lady that put it on.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you're not going to set someone in that state down for a hypnosis session or get an honest interview about their childhood trauma. So how do you approach a situation that is that far removed from your traditional approach?
Through a very, very dangerous method that I really do not like to employ, but if it's absolutely necessary, I will. Have you ever seen Robin Williams in What Dreams May Come?
Actually, no.
Okay, so that is a movie that I would highly suggest you watch at some point. It's a beautiful movie, real tear, jerker too. But the closest description, I won't ruin the movie for you, but the closest description I can give to you would be like that movie. And what it is it's a technique called swan dive. And what swan dive is when you force mirror neuron rapport with an individual. So it's kind of like forced empathy control. So you're feeling everything that they're feeling. You're joining into their psychosis and delusion. You're kind of surfing through the fourth dimension to find them. And you have to dive through what they're experiencing and what they're going through. It's absolutely terrifying, if I'm being completely honest. I really, really hate using that technique. And you have to really amplify your energies and raise your state quite a bit, because that's going to be your anchor to get back. If you don't manage to make it back, then you become lost in psychosis and you fracture mentally into a million pieces, and you're just as screwed as the client is. But yeah, swan dive is a way of doing it. There's also a couple of really lengthy and drawn out Buddhist rituals that I've learned, such as like the Sudpanyak, where you call on the yaksa from the lower heavens dimension, essentially, where these entities are like half god, half devil in a way. They have worldly desires. They die and are reborn. And even though they are gods in their own right, they're also very much so like us, more than they are God-like in nature. So they tend to be entities worth working with in some of these regards. And when you do the Sudpanyak, you're opening yourself as a Nexion point, and you're channeling an entire dimension of energy through your body in these very exuberant trance-like states. Anytime I've done the Sudpanyak for a client, like everyone in the room that's even around the energy is freaking pouring sweat by the end of it. Like the energy's that intense that you could have an AC unit on, everybody can be chilling and fine at the beginning of it, but then energy starts peaking and intensifying, and all of a sudden like you're just sweating, things will kind of move around, paranormal phenomena occurs. It's wild, but channeling a dimension through you and allowing like half god, half demons to like essentially come through your body and, heal and help somebody. It's a pretty intense process too.
You said something that was very interesting to me there, and it's something that I have never thought about, but extra dimensional entities also reincarnating is a fascinating thought experiment.
Oh yeah. Some of these entities still have desires and attachments. And we think of, in the concepts of enlightenment and, being free, right? That we're going to this place that we don't recognize. Think of this as like going up to a much, much, much higher dimension. But there's dimensions along that way. And I guess that's kind of one of the things that slips people's minds is, it talks about in the Dhamma and, these Buddhist scriptures where we read the stories about, Buddha and, his journey and his teachings. And, when he achieved enlightenment, they said all these heavenly realms and all these deities and stuff were rejoicing. Well, if they're these heavenly deities, this is the question that I kind of like got, hung up on. And I asked one of my masters about, he made sense of it for me. I was like, well, these are heavenly deities. So like, a human from a lower dimension becoming enlightened, like, why would that be a big deal to him? And the way Master Thanaful explained it to me was that just because they're in a higher dimension doesn't mean that they don't suffer as well. They might be more evolved in a sense, but they can still suffer. And the way that I kind of look at that is in a literal context of, third world, first world. Okay. You have people in third world countries who struggle to eat, who struggle to afford basic, medical care and things of that nature. They suffer greatly. But you have people in first world countries who have it a lot better off and are ahead in many different ways. And they're very blessed and fortunate. But yet you also still have a lot of suffering. People living paycheck to paycheck. And even though they're living paycheck to paycheck and they're suffering and they're in this poverty and can't afford, the best healthcare and stuff, are they not still leagues ahead in comfort and stability than these people in these third world countries? So kind of take that into transition with some of these spiritual realms that are higher than ours. And you can have these godlike deities that live for thousands of years at a time, but they can still receive types of illnesses that might be strange and foreign to us because we can't understand them because we're not living in, the bounds and rules of those dimensions. But, they still affect these entities, these beings, and they also still suffer to karma and they still die, and it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because, it definitely applies up the scale.
Yeah, that is a perfect example of things I've never thought about that looking back on, why have I never thought about that before? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes total sense, right? Yeah, why is that an earthly physical thing? Why would that ever be so specific? Like, of course it applies to other dimensions as well. But yeah, a little throwaway line that you tossed out, and it, I'm sitting here now in my head going through my own personal philosophy on things.
Well, we focus on what's tangible, right?
Right.
So as your practices grow, you learn how to cultivate chi and things like that. Well, then energy becomes tangible. What wasn't real or focused on before now becomes real and now is focused on. It's just kind of growing a perspective and awareness, in my thought.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. It's fantastic. Let's backtrack just a little bit and let's go back to in magic in Buddhism. What does magic physically look like to onlookers? I mean, are we talking about similar rituals to, say, Thelema and things down that scope with, hoods and robes and candles and sex magic and things like that? Are we talking about what's a physical representation of the magic that you do?
I love this question so much because it always blows people's minds. And when I explain it, they're like, but that also makes so much sense. There is no, and this is the mind blow right off the top. There is no magic in Buddhism. So what I mean by that is it wasn't a part of Buddhism. It became a part of Buddhism later on. So pre-14th century, think of the land of Siam, modern day Thailand. You had animistic practices. This was the dominant form of magic and tradition. You had things like in Burma, like Nat worship, and they would have these local land spirits and things that they would worship through, like the representation being coconuts, and they would, these spirits would live inside of the coconuts, and they would give them offering and things, and they would pray to them to help, with the lands and bless them, and just for very basic things that helped make life a little more comfortable. They would seek out the spirits. Then you had, like, in the 14th century was when Buddhism started to take over, and basically Thailand is like at this point, like, okay, we're going to be Buddhist now. Like, this is a thing. This is happening. We're not going to be doing any more old animistic practices. Like, that's just not a thing anymore. Well, that didn't go over well, obviously. And so you got this, like, mixture where these old oral traditions known as different witcha, practices of magic, kind of stayed. And then you got, like, Pali, spells. So there's a lot of, like, kata chanting of, these sacred words, right? These mantras, if you will. For example, like Kruba Krisana, he's a famous monk in Thailand. He has this this mantra called the butterfly mantra. Whenever he would say this mantra, which is, Siri Ramye Ramye Ye Ram Krisa Nahare Krisa Nanamapata, he would get into this repetitious state of saying this mantra, and it would tie him to these specific energies, right? The specific current of energy that these phonetic, enunciations are essentially representing a very certain frequency. Through creating that state of samadhi that links him to that frequency, he's able to do very specific type of magic with that kata. So you have a lot of magic systems that were based on using like chanting types of magic. And then you get like sakyant tattoos, the Pali script spell tattoos, and yant cloths, where they put the Pali spells and stuff on these cloths. And these are like magic totems, like, they emit magical force. And then you have like the Hunpeon came from old villagers that would take straw and they would make these straw figures. So they were making like egregores, from straw to like help protect the house from burglars and things of that nature. You have a lot of really old animistic type of magic that is majority of what Buddhist magic is. When we talk of Thai Buddhist magic, we're talking about mixing, mantra and the use of it for a very specific purpose with old traditional types of magic that are celebrated all over the world in many different cultures. It's working with the land, working with land spirits. You're giving it that flavor of Thai culture as well, but it's all kind of packaged under Buddhism.
Yeah, this is a newer aspect to my knowledge within Buddhism. So you're kind of giving me like the introductory course, and I think that's great because I think a lot of the people listening are going to be in the same sort of state that I am, right? I'm guessing that there aren't many people in your area here of Thai Buddhist magic that would care so much for manifestation of physical things like money, for example, because within the Buddhist philosophy, it would be kind of counterproductive to do a magical spell for something, like money, right?
Oh, on the contrary.
Really?
Thai amulets are a major multi-billion-dollar industry in Thailand. And if you go to Thailand or you meet a Thai family even here in America that is, practicing Theravada Buddhist, more than likely they're going to be wearing at least a couple Thai amulets. A lot of them have the representation of like the Sondesh Bra is considered to be one of the most powerful types of amulets. There's so many different types. You have one with that shows the Buddha meditating, and it's usually made with holy powders, and a lot of the it's become so entrenched into the culture at this point that people don't really second guess it anymore. The Thai police, they wear takruts, these rolled metal sheets that have like, Pali prayers like inscribed on there, and they use them for like invulnerability and protection, when they're doing the job. People carry images of Lungpor Tuad in their car to help them so that they don't get in car accidents, or if they do, that the car accident isn't going to be that bad for them, and that they might be spared by the grace of Lungpor Tuad. And all these different aspects, like shopkeepers with non-quack statues to help bring in more business. I mean, I can go on and on. Salika birds, amulets, and Nku for helping troubled marriages. And I mean, it's just so saturated into the culture. I'm wearing a few Thai amulets myself right now, and the main thing is like I guess where it all ties back in layers and layers is you use certain kata to kind of like activate the power of the amulet. And then you're also doing good deeds, making merit to help keep the strength of the amulet. And a lot of these amulets made by some of these monks have certain coatings on it where you have to follow these precepts or these rules or the amulet won't work. Like you can't lie, you can't steal, you can't murder, you can't deface the Buddha or a temple, you can't be adulterous. if you do these things, your amulet won't work, and you're going to have to go back to the temple. You're going to have to essentially ask forgiveness from the monk and have it reconsecrated and re-blessed for it to actually work again and be able to tap into the magical power of that amulet. And a lot of these amulets, the reason why they're even made is you have so many really old temples in Thailand that have been falling apart. It costs money to rebuild them. And obviously, when you're selling these amulets, they're not selling it for profit. They're more so, they call it renting. So you rent an amulet, even though you can keep it, till the day you die and pass it on to children. The term is still called renting. So you rent the amulet from a temple, and the temple will make these amulets with the intention of the money that is accrued from the sale of these amulets is going to go into restoring the temple, or to feeding the monks, or to going to a charity, or helping with hospital, getting, vaccinations or medicines and things. It's just such a huge part of the culture.
Is there a corporate corruption into this at all? Into this business of selling
100%.
Yeah.
Fake amulet market is a huge thing too. And unless you really, really know amulets very well, it's very hard to tell a fake amulet from a real amulet. A lot of these are handmade by monks. So what's to stop somebody who's not a monk that has one that's handmade to be able to get the same types of materials, say this was made by the same monk, and go turn around and sell it?
Mm-hmm.
So some of the amulets will have certain stamps or codes on them so that it's genuine from a certain temple, or they'll come with letters of authenticity. But even then, you can still fake some of those.
Yeah.
So the way that people who are smart about this, and they tend to have a very, very trusted source that they go through to get amulets, or they go and they get them directly from the monks of the temples. If you're not doing it either of those ways, then, there's a pretty strong chance that you bought a fake amulet.
That also begs the question, with our chi or our thought energy, if we believe that the amulet has this sort of power, do we have some aspect of a cheap knockoff amulet actually reinforcing our beliefs and then manifesting that desired reaction from this amulet?
To a certain degree, I would definitely say yes, that can be a factor. I would also argue against that, saying that some of the witcha that is performed to make some of these amulets, it's very undeniable. And what I mean by this is, you have certain auspicious woods and processes of making it, they'll take old, scriptures, and this would make a historian's skin crawl. They'll take some of their oldest Buddhist archive text, and they'll literally burn the papers, from these old, one of a kind, historical documents, and then they'll make a holy powder from the ash, and they use the consecration of, let's say you have a temple, for example, I'll use a mitmor, for example. So it's a holy knife, an exorcist knife, a blessing knife, used for a lot of different things. So they'll take a nail from the roof of the temple, and then they'll flatten it into a blade, and then they'll inscribe it with Pali, spell work, and then they'll do different witcha performed on it. And then what makes this a very holy blade versus another one that you would just say is a thumb, right? So you're saying this is a fake one. Well, you compare the two, and if you feel energy, you definitely feel the difference, because the one that's genuine, what it has that's missing from the other one is this nail came from a roof that housed all these monks for hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
Very old temples. All of the morning, mantras, all the prayers, all the devotion, all the worship, all of this just powerful energy over hundreds of years soaked into all the material, the building, the ground itself. And you're taking a nail from that ceiling and you're crafting, a spiritual blade with it. I mean, I feel energy, I have Qigong practices, I've, done Vipassana, and I have my meditations, and, I've been cultivating my Qi, for a long time, and I can definitely feel Qi just as easily as you touching your own hand and feeling that you're touching your own hand. I feel energy on that level of intimacy. If I'm given a fake amulet, I can tell right away just by feeling it. I don't even need to know the origin of it. I can hold it and I can tell you if it's a powerful amulet, regardless of what it looks like. Or I can tell you, this feels dead. It feels lifeless. Doesn't feel like there's anything here.
Yeah, I mean, talking about taking the nail from the roof, I mean, you're basically taking a spiritual battery, right? I mean,
yeah.
It just stores energy for, all these years, and it doesn't go away. It's in that nail, This kind of circles back to the ghost subject that we were talking about. You had mentioned the different types of entities and things briefly. How do you feel about these stories that people have of recurring specific scenes of hauntings where they see a ghost on a staircase looking out a window, maybe the same exact, like a reel of film over and over again? How does that fit in with all this?
I mean, that's what we would just call like an imprint haunting. Usually they're non-intelligent, like they're not like aware, or, even the spirit involved with that scene that you're describing probably isn't even around anymore. Mm-hmm. But you have this imprint of energy because for whatever condition, whether it have been, solstice or, the geography of the land, a lot of quartz crystal underground, running waterways, etc. Like, if the conditions are right to store or amplify energies, and energies peak in a certain place, or even at a certain time, if you will, then you could definitely get an imprint. It's kind of like, let's say you have, somebody standing against a wall, and it's an all white wall, and they don't have any paint on them, right? But let's say they've rubbed their hand on the wall, the oils of their finger, you might see a little smudge on the wall, and it might not even be that noticeable. Let's say enough times, or with enough pressure, or for a long enough, amount of time, a person put their handprint on a spot on that white wall, the oils in their fingers and everything, or their hands were just really dirty. Would it be far-fetched to say when they removed their hand from that wall that print on the wall could be seen by people, and that person could be gone for, a long time, years even, and nothing was done with the wall? Like that could just still be the handprint there? It's the same with an imprint.
Yeah, that's how, like, this is why I circled back. Like, we call it like the stone tape theory, right? So areas that have these large quartz deposits and these large granite deposits and underground flowing water, this like perfect recipe, seem to be areas that sort of do that little recording that they play back every so often. That's where I came back to this from, was the roof nail of a monastery. The same basic principle, just a different type of energy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, in some aspects, it can even be corrupted. Perfect example, there are such things as abandoned or haunted temples in Thailand. And you're like, okay, well, if a bunch of monks were there and this was considered a holy place, like, how could that change? Like, wouldn't that leave a lasting imprint on the land? Well, yes and no. So the energy was left there, and the energy might have been in a certain state, but something could come along because it's not being upkept and there's nothing being done with it, and it can feed on the fringes of it until it gets to the core, and then it can convert the core, and then what you had as like very divine energy can then be turned to very malicious energy. It can get hijacked. This is also why when I have, new students that come to me, they're like, oh, I've been practicing this or that for, years, and, I've got an altar, and the first thing I ask them to do is I ask them to show me their altar, because what I'm looking at is to see if they have placement of certain things on there. Are those affecting the energies? Is there disharmony in their altar? If they have statues of gods or goddesses, are they properly consecrated? Are they unknowingly feeding random, land spirits or, entities? Are they consuming the altar energy and using that energy? Or is it just building up and then getting milked off by something else somewhere else? Like, a lot of times, like, altars will hold these energies and people aren't actually using their altar energy.
Yeah, and it's basically like an open buffet that's just sitting there for whoever happens to walk by, right? Whoever's hungry.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Man, this has been a really great conversation, and I think this is going to be one of my favorite episodes to go back and listen to. I hate to cut this off, but I want to cut this off in hopes that we can do this again and get into some more topics in the future.
I would love that. Yes, I would love that.
Otherwise, this is going to be like a 3-hour episode and nobody has time for that. We all have
we can break it up.
Yeah, we all have the attention span of a goldfish, I think, when it comes to listening to podcasts. So before I let you go and cut you loose, first off, I definitely have to have you back on because there's a lot more I want to talk about. Time has flown by. I just looked at the clock and I can't believe we've been talking for this long already. But second of all, thank you so much for coming on. And third of all, where can people connect with you online or in person or however you prefer?
So if anybody wanted to get a hold of me, they could go to www.thesadhudah.com, and that's TheSadhudah.com. Check out my blog, see my videos, my services that I offer, my rates, my amulet market, pretty much everything to do with Sadhu Dah. You can find me over there.
That's terrific. I'll make sure I put the link in the notes and on the website like I do for everyone that comes on the show. So head over to paranormalpatio.com if you aren't there already and check out the links for this episode and you will find Sadhu Dah and you will be grateful that you did. Yeah, thanks again for coming on, man. This has been just awesome.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for having me. I will definitely come back again.
I am looking forward to it. You might be the first guest to appear twice in the same season.
Fair enough.
I love it. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care. Be safe. Love you. Come back for the next episode and all the other episodes that are coming for season 3. We're just getting started with season 3. It's terrific. Many more to come. So we'll see you on the next one.
Until next time, keep the fire going.